Meat and dairy products. Should they be consumed together? A misunderstanding of Scripture has resulted in differing dietary beliefs and practices among Messianics, Jews, and Christians concerning meat and dairy consumption. This video will properly analyze and interpret the associated Scripture verses involved, as well as the differing dietary practices followed, and will declare that meat and dairy products may be consumed together. Exodus 23 verse 19, 34 verse 26, Deuteronomy 14 verse 21, Tree of Life version. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Meat and dairy product kashrut kosher rules. Mainstream Judaism teaches that consuming meat and dairy products together is prohibited based on God's command, repeated 3 times in Scripture, to not boil or seethe a kid in its mother's milk. Rabbinical Judaism does not allow the mixing or the eating of meat and dairy products together. During the human digestive process, consumed food literally boils or seethes inside the stomach, where food is saturated in digestive acid and is chemically broken down. Traditional rabbinical Judaism concludes that eating meat and milk-derived dairy products together is prohibited, based on the belief that digesting meat and dairy together amounts to boiling or seething meat and dairy. Meat is not to be eaten or cooked with milk, butter, cheese, or any other dairy product. Meat and dairy products are not to be consumed together within a traditional time period, spanning anywhere between 30 minutes to 6 hours, the time it normally takes food to pass from the stomach. Rabbinical Judaism's Talmudic kashrut kosher laws require households to make provisions, ensuring that meat does not come into contact with milk and dairy products. A kosher, kashrut-compliant household will have at least 2 sets of utensils, sinks, refrigerators, pots, pans, and dishes, 1 set for meat and 1 set for dairy products. These are Rabbinical Judaism's traditional commands that replace the commandment of God.
Separate meat and dairy dish sets fully. Use and label separate storage spaces, like cabinets and fridge areas, for meat and dairy items. You will also need to use separate cookware, utensils, salt and pepper shakers, bread trays, draining racks, dish towels, and tablecloths for meat and dairy items, as these items also cannot be prepared together or eaten at the same meal. It is common to use color coding to distinguish between the meat and dairy items. For example, buy a blue set of cookware for meat and a red set for dairy. If you cannot buy entirely new sets, use a kosher paint pen to specify which food category that utensil should be used for. Cabinets or pantries do not require kashering, as it is assumed that kosher food will be stored securely inside kosher containers. However, feel free to deep clean the cabinets to hold to the true spirit of kashrut.
These misguided sets of kashrut rules, which include separate meat and dairy sinks for the washing of utensils, pots, pitchers, and cups, are the traditional laws of the elders spoken of by the Pharisees and scribes. Yeshua, Jesus, addressed the traditional kashrut, commandments of men, teachings when he referenced the washing of pitchers and cups in Mark 7, verse 7 through 8. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do. Rabbinical Judaism's doctrine of prohibiting the cooking and eating of meat and milk-derived dairy products together is an incorrect interpretation of God's command against cooking a kid in its mother's milk, failing to cross-reference and acknowledge the Scripture verse, Genesis 18, verse 7 through 8, that shows that meat and dairy may be served and consumed together. Genesis 18, verse 7 through 8, New King James Version. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hurried to prepare it. And he took curds and milk and the calf, which he had prepared, and put it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. Due to a misinterpretation and failure to make a precept upon precept comparison of Scripture, the erroneous teaching prohibiting the consumption of meat and dairy products together has remained an erroneous teaching and tradition. Rabbinical Judaism's kosher kashrut rules forbidding the eating of meat and milk-derived dairy products together is a false doctrine. Meat with milk and dairy. Scripture confirms that meat and dairy products may be consumed together, as Abraham served Yahweh the Lord and his other two guests meat and dairy together for a meal, and they did eat. It should be presumed that the calf served was a mature calf, having been weaned off feeding from its mother's milk. Yahweh the Lord did not admonish Abraham for serving meat and dairy together. It is not possible that Yahweh the Lord would eat meat and dairy together if this was a violation of God's dietary laws. If it were unlawful to eat meat and dairy together, Abraham, as well as Yahweh the Lord and the men with him, would be guilty of sin by violating a dietary law. Since Yahweh the Lord did eat what Abraham served him, and did not rebuke Abraham for serving meat and dairy together, we can conclude that meat and dairy consumed together is permissible. Genesis 18 verse 7 through 8 is scriptural proof that meat and milk-based dairy products may be consumed together. Cattle are not mothers of lambs. If one was to eat lamb meat and drink a glass of milk from a cow, the milk consumed did not come from the lamb's mother. The same goes for eating chicken with milk, as birds are not even mammals and do not nurse their young with milk. Therefore, the rabbinical doctrine prohibiting eating all meat and all dairy products together from all mammal and bird species far exceeds and lays aside the specific command to not eat a kid, a young mammal, with its own mother's milk. What then is the meaning and correct interpretation of what God commanded when he said, "Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk"? Proper interpretation. The scripture verses regarding not boiling a kid in its mother's milk should be interpreted and understood in the following way. Exodus 23 verse 19, 34 verse 26, Deuteronomy 14 verse 21, Tree of Life version with interpretation. Do not boil, cook, a kid, young mammal, in, that is still nursing on, its mother's milk. Nursing mammals. The command not to boil a kid in its mother's milk literally means not to cook a young mammal that has milk inside it from its mother. Milk is in a young mammal that is nursing milk from its mother. All mammals nurse their newborn young, and while young mammals are still feeding on their mother's milk, we are commanded not to cook and thereby not consume them. The command equates to, do not cook young mammals while their mother's milk is in them. Cattle nurse their calves during their first 6 to 8 months. It is prohibited to cook a calf while it is in, nursing on, its mother's milk. This would prohibit the eating of veal, where young cattle are slaughtered while they are still nursing on their mother's milk. If you cook and consume veal, you are cooking and eating a calf that literally still has its mother's milk, digesting and providing nourishment inside it. Mammals should first be weaned off their mother's milk before they are slaughtered for meat and consumed. God's similar mercy commands towards animals. Leviticus 22, verse 28, New King James Version. Whether it is a cow or ewe, do not kill both her and her young on the same day. Deuteronomy 22, verse 6 through 7, New King James Version. If a bird's nest happens to be before you along the way, in any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, with the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs. You shall not take the mother with the young. You shall surely let the mother go, and take the young for yourself, that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days. The command against cooking young mammals while they are nursing on their mother's milk is a command demonstrating God's mercy towards animals, similar to Leviticus 22 verse 28 and Deuteronomy 22 verse 6 through 7. God commands us not to slaughter and therefore eat mammals and their offspring on the same day. Additionally, God prohibits us from slaughtering birds together with their chicks or eggs, commanding us to let the mother go free and live. This command of mercy, to let the mother bird go free and live and keep the chicks or eggs, comes with a promise of wellness and longevity. If a promise of wellness and prolonged days comes to those who obey God's mercy commands concerning animals, the alternative will be the case if those commands are ignored and violated. If a person slaughters and consumes a hen together with her eggs, or cooks and then eats a calf that is still feeding on its mother's milk, veal, and continually does this throughout his or her life, then a curse of sickness and a shortened lifespan may ensue. If sickness and shortened days could result from continually eating veal, then veal should be considered unclean. The command against boiling a kid in its mother's milk is a specific command against cooking and eating young mammals still nursing and being nourished on their mother's milk inside them, and is not a command against consuming matured animal meat and dairy products together. The doctrine prohibiting the eating of all meat and dairy products together is a false doctrinal teaching of rabbinical Judaism. Messianic and other believers who wish to properly obey the command not to boil a kid in its mother's milk should simply avoid eating veal, the most common young mammal that is slaughtered while still nursing on its mother's milk.
Compared to other meats, veal is paler in color, has a delicate taste and is tender.
Cooking and consuming veal is a violation of Exodus 23 verse 19, 34 verse 26, and Deuteronomy 14 verse 21. Meat and dairy products, otherwise, can be consumed together. So go ahead and enjoy your cheeseburger, preferably one that is grass-fed, hormone-free, and low-fat.